A wedding was supposed to help heal France. Instead, it helped open the gates to one of the most infamous massacres in European history. In August 1572, Paris filled with nobles, soldiers, servants, merchants, clergy, diplomats, and ordinary spectators. They had come for a royal marriage. The Protestant Henry of Navarre was marrying Margaret of Valois, sister of the Catholic King of France. It was meant to symbolize reconciliation after years of religious war. A Catholic princess, a Protestant prince, a divided kingdom, briefly pretending it could still become whole. Then an assassin's shot struck one of the most powerful Protestant leaders in France. The wound did not kill him. The fear that followed killed thousands. Within days, the streets of Paris became a hunting ground. Protestant nobles were dragged from their lodgings. Bodies were thrown from windows. Blood ran through neighborhoods that had just witnessed a royal wedding. The violence spread beyond the capital into other towns, carrying the logic of panic across the kingdom. The marriage of peace became the prelude to massacre. Welcome to the History Docket, where history's greatest disasters are reopened. Before we enter Paris in the summer of 1572, give this episode a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your verdict in the comments as the case unfolds. Because this is not a simple story of one order, one villain, or one night of religious madness. It is a case about religious hatred, court politics, royal weakness, aristocratic revenge, public fear, urban rumor, and the deadly moment when rulers decide that murder is safer than uncertainty. This is the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. A peace built on suspicion. A wedding surrounded by armed enemies. A failed assassination that became a national catastrophe. A king too young to command trust. A queen mother accused for centuries. A noble house hungry for revenge. A Protestant leader who wanted to pull France into war. And a city where the word threat became permission to kill. Chapter 1. A kingdom divided against itself. France in the 16th century was not a weak kingdom in the ordinary sense. It was large, wealthy, prestigious, and culturally powerful. Its monarchy had deep traditions. Its kings were not ceremonial shadows. French royal authority mattered. French armies mattered. French diplomacy mattered. The kingdom stood near the center of European politics. But beneath that power, France had become dangerously divided. The Reformation had split Western Christendom. What began as theological dispute became a political and social earthquake. Questions of doctrine turned into questions of loyalty. Questions of worship turned into questions of obedience. A person's faith could mark them not only as wrong, but as dangerous. In France, Protestants became known as Huguenots. They were a minority, but not an insignificant one. Their numbers varied by region and class, but they included nobles, urban professionals, merchants, artisans, and local communities. Some powerful aristocratic families embraced or protected the Protestant cause. That made the French religious crisis more explosive than a simple dispute among preachers. If Protestantism had remained only a private belief held by isolated individuals, the monarchy might have suppressed it more easily. But Protestantism became connected to noble networks, armed followings, regional power, and international Protestant sympathy. The French crown faced a nightmare. If it tolerated Protestant worship too broadly, many Catholics saw that as betrayal of the true faith. If it crushed Protestants completely, it risked civil war against powerful nobles and towns. If it tried compromise, both sides suspected weakness. And once blood was shed, compromise became harder every year. The French Wars of Religion began in 1562 after the killing of Protestants at Vassy by forces associated with Francis, Duke of Guise. That event helped ignite open war between Catholic and Protestant factions. The wars that followed were not continuous in one clean line. They came in waves: fighting, truces, edicts, renewed suspicion, fresh violence, new negotiations, and then more fighting. By 1572, France had already lived through years of religious war. That matters. A massacre does not begin on the morning it happens. It begins in memories, in sermons, in rumors, in funerals, in old wounds that never healed. The French court tried repeatedly to manage the conflict. Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother, played a central role in royal policy after the death of her husband, Henry II, in 1559. Her sons became kings in a time when the monarchy needed adult strength and often had youth, illness, and factional pressure instead. Catherine has often been portrayed as the dark spider of the Valois court, manipulative, calculating, foreign, poisonously clever. That image is partly the product of propaganda, misogyny, political hatred, and later legend. She was certainly a skilled and ruthless political actor when she felt the dynasty was threatened. But she was also a mother trying to preserve the crown for sons who inherited a kingdom tearing itself apart. That does not absolve her. It makes the case more interesting. The French monarchy was trying to survive between extremes. On one side stood militant Catholics who believed heresy must be eliminated and who often looked to the powerful Guise family for leadership. On the other stood Huguenot nobles who demanded security, rights of worship, political guarantees, and influence at court. The monarchy wanted peace, but peace required trust. France had almost none left. Chapter 2: The Court of Knives. Royal courts are often imagined as places of silk, ceremony, music, and polished speech. The French court in 1572 had all of that. It also had fear. Every smile could hide a faction. Every marriage could become a treaty. Every treaty could become a trap. Every private conversation might be reported to someone else before evening. The central figure of the court was King Charles IX. He was young, emotional, intelligent in some ways, unstable in others, and caught between powerful influences. He wanted to be king in reality, not merely in title. But he had grown up in a kingdom where his mother, Catherine, had long exercised enormous influence, where noble factions pressured the crown, and where religious conflict made every royal decision dangerous. Charles was not a puppet in a simple sense, but he was not a sovereign towering above events. He was a young king surrounded by men and women who wanted something from him, feared something through him, or tried to control what he would become. Among the Catholic powers at court, the Guise family was especially important. The Guise family were noble, militant, connected to Catholic hardliners, and associated with the memory of anti-Protestant violence. They also carried a personal grievance. Francis, Duke of Guise, had been assassinated in 1563 by a Protestant. Many Catholics blamed Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, one of the leading Huguenot nobles, for complicity, though the matter was contested. Coligny is one of the central figures in the file. He was a Protestant nobleman and admiral of France, experienced, respected by Huguenots, and increasingly influential with King Charles IX in the months before the massacre. He had survived war, defeat, and political struggle. To Huguenots, he was a leader. To many Catholics, he was a dangerous heretic and rebel. To the Guise family, he was linked to old blood. Coligny also had a foreign policy vision. He wanted France to intervene against Spain in the Netherlands, where Protestant Dutch rebels were fighting Spanish rule. For Coligny, this could serve several purposes. It could unite Frenchmen in an external war. It could support fellow Protestants. It could weaken Spain, France's great rival. It could redirect the violent energy of French nobles away from civil war. But to Catherine and others at court, war with Spain was terrifying. Spain under Philip II was the greatest Catholic monarchy in Europe. France was internally divided, financially strained, and still recovering from civil wars. To provoke Spain while the French kingdom remained unstable could be disastrous. Catherine feared that Coligny's influence over Charles might pull the king into a war France could not safely fight. So the court was divided not only by religion. It was divided by strategy. Should France reconcile internally and avoid external war? Should France support Protestant rebels in the Netherlands? Should the king rely on Coligny? Should the Guise family be restrained? Could Huguenot nobles be trusted inside Paris? Could militant Catholics be controlled in the streets? Every question contained a threat. Then came the marriage. Chapter 3: The Wedding of Peace. The marriage between Henry of Navarre and Margaret of Valois was meant to bridge the religious divide. Henry of Navarre was a Protestant prince of Bourbon blood, a major figure among the Huguenots, and a man with a possible claim in the wider dynastic landscape of France. Margaret, often known as Margot, was the king's sister, a Catholic princess of the Valois dynasty. Their marriage was political architecture. It was supposed to show that the crown stood above faction. It was supposed to reassure Protestants that they had a place in the kingdom. It was supposed to demonstrate Catholic and Protestant reconciliation through royal blood. It was supposed to reduce civil war by binding rival interests into one family. That was the theory. But a marriage cannot erase a decade of killing. Paris was overwhelmingly Catholic and deeply hostile to Huguenots. The presence of so many Protestant nobles in the capital was alarming to many Parisians. The city's preachers had long inflamed fear of heresy. Rumors moved quickly. The people of Paris did not necessarily see the wedding as a miracle of peace. Many saw it as contamination, insult, danger. Huguenot nobles arrived for the celebration. That meant many of the movement's leaders were gathered in one place. From one perspective, this was a sign of trust. From another, it was a target list. The wedding took place on August 18, 1572. Because Henry was Protestant and Margaret Catholic, the ceremony itself had complications. It did not simply erase confessional difference. The marriage was celebrated amid tension, ritual ambiguity, and political calculation. The court shone with spectacle, but the glow did not reach deeply into the streets. Royal weddings are meant to produce unity. This one concentrated danger. Catholic militants feared Huguenot influence at court. Huguenots feared Catholic treachery. The Guise family hated Coligny. Catherine feared Coligny's influence over her son. Charles wanted royal authority and perhaps admired Coligny. Paris hated the Protestant presence. The Huguenot nobles trusted the king enough to attend. That trust would prove fatal. Chapter 4: The Shot That Failed. On August 22, 1572, Admiral Coligny was shot. He was returning from the Louvre to his lodgings when an assassin fired from a window. The shot did not kill him, but it seriously wounded him, injuring his hand and arm. The assassin escaped. Suspicion immediately fell on the Guise faction because of their old feud with Coligny. Many Huguenots believed the attack had been arranged by their enemies at court. The failed assassination changed everything. Had Coligny died instantly, the crisis might have taken one form. Because he survived, it became something more unstable. A wounded Coligny could speak. His supporters could gather around him. Huguenot nobles could demand justice. The king could be pressured to investigate. The Guise family could be accused. Catherine could fear exposure or retaliation. Paris could become a powder barrel. Charles IX visited Coligny after the attack and promised justice. The king's emotion in this moment matters. He appears to have been angered by the assault on a man under royal protection. If a noble invited to a royal wedding could be shot in Paris, what did royal peace mean? What did the king's word mean? What did royal authority mean? For the Huguenots, the attack looked like proof that reconciliation had been a trap. For militant Catholics, Huguenot anger looked like the beginning of revenge. For the court, the problem was immediate and terrifying. If Coligny's followers retaliated against the Guise family, Paris could explode. If the king punished the Guise family, Catholic outrage might explode. If the king did nothing, Huguenot trust would collapse. If Coligny recovered and increased his influence over Charles, Catherine might lose control over the direction of the kingdom. And if Huguenot nobles believed the crown itself had been complicit, they might leave Paris and restart civil war with the moral advantage of betrayal. This is where the case moves from tension to panic. A shot was fired at one man, but it hit the structure of trust holding the fragile peace together. Chapter 5: The Night Council. The most contested question in the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre is this: who decided to kill? Not who killed in the streets. Not who hated Protestants. Not who benefited afterward. But who made the decision at the center of power that transformed a crisis into a massacre? The answer is still debated. Catherine de Medici has long been accused of orchestrating the whole event, either from the beginning or after the attack on Coligny. Some older accounts make her the mastermind, coldly arranging the assassination attempt and then expanding it into a purge. Other historians are more cautious, seeing the massacre as a desperate and improvised decision by the royal council after the failed attempt on Coligny created fear of Huguenot retaliation. King Charles IX himself cannot be removed from responsibility. The killing of Huguenot leaders in Paris was carried out under royal authority, or at least with royal approval once the decision was made. Later royal explanations tried to frame the violence as a preemptive strike against a supposed Huguenot plot. Whether the king believed this fully, was pressured into accepting it, or later used it as justification is part of the uncertainty. What seems clear is that after the failed attack on Coligny, the royal circle decided that leading Huguenots should be eliminated. The logic was preventive murder. If the Huguenots were about to rebel, then killing their leaders could save the king. If Coligny was about to drag France into war or dominate Charles, killing him could preserve royal policy. If the Guise family and Huguenots were about to fight in Paris, killing one faction's leaders could prevent wider chaos. These arguments are monstrous, but they are not rare in political history. Rulers in panic often convince themselves that the smaller crime prevents the larger disaster. But murder is not a firebreak when the city is soaked in oil. The initial target may have been limited, Coligny and a group of Huguenot leaders. But once royal permission, Catholic hatred, urban fear, and armed men were unleashed, the violence escaped any narrow boundary. This is one of the essential lessons of the massacre. A state can begin by authorizing selective killing. It cannot always control what selective killing teaches everyone else. If the king's enemies may be killed tonight, who counts as the king's enemy? If heretics may be killed, who identifies a heretic? If old grievances can be settled under cover of religious duty, who will stop them? If the bells ring and armed men move, how does one command the crowd to distinguish policy from vengeance? The court may have imagined a decapitation strike. Paris heard a license. Chapter 6: The Bell and the Streets. In the early hours of August 24th, the feast day of Saint Bartholomew, the killing began. Coligny was one of the first major targets. Men forced their way into his lodgings. He was killed, and his body was thrown from a window or otherwise delivered into the hands of his enemies, depending on the account. His corpse was mutilated. The admiral, who had survived battlefield and politics, was destroyed in a royal city during a wedding peace. But the violence did not stop with Coligny. Other Huguenot nobles were attacked in their lodgings. Men who had come under royal protection were hunted down. Some were killed in the Louvre itself or near the center of royal power. Henry of Navarre and Henry of Condé survived, but only under extreme pressure. Both were forced to convert to Catholicism, at least outwardly, to save their lives. The massacre spread through Paris. Catholic militia, guards, servants, neighbors, and opportunists joined the killing. Houses were searched. People were dragged into streets. Bodies were stripped, robbed, mutilated, and thrown into the Seine. Old debts, personal grudges, greed, religious hatred, and fear all mixed together. The city became a machine for identifying and eliminating Protestants. Some Catholics protected Protestant friends, relatives, or clients. This matters. Even in massacre, society does not become one thing. There were rescuers, hiders, hesitators, and people appalled by what they saw, but their actions could not stop the wider eruption. Paris had long been prepared for this violence by years of preaching and fear. Many Catholics believed Protestantism was not merely an alternate faith, but a disease threatening the body of Christendom. Heresy was imagined as contamination, treason, rebellion, and divine insult. In that mental world, killing could be understood not as crime, but as purification. This does not excuse the killers. It explains how ordinary people can do extraordinary evil while believing themselves defenders of order. Rumor intensified everything. People heard that Huguenots were plotting to kill the king. They heard that Protestants were about to seize the city. They heard that royal orders had been given. They heard that not killing might be dangerous. In the streets, rumor is not background noise. Rumor is command. A man does not need to see a written order if everyone around him believes the order exists. This is how fear becomes action. Chapter 7: The King's Story. After the violence began, the crown needed an explanation. The first instinct may have been confusion, denial, or shifting blame. But soon, a royal version emerged. The king had acted to prevent a Huguenot conspiracy. The killings were framed as a necessary move against rebels who threatened the crown. This explanation served an obvious purpose. It made the king actor rather than hostage. It turned massacre into security policy. It transformed murdered guests into traitors. It gave Catholics a justification and foreign courts a narrative. But the explanation was also unstable. If there really had been a vast Huguenot conspiracy, why had the wedding been allowed? Why were the Protestant nobles invited? Why did the violence expand into uncontrolled killing? Why were so many ordinary people murdered? Why were bodies robbed and mutilated? Why did the massacre spread after the supposed immediate threat was gone? The story of a preventive strike could explain the murder of a small number of leaders, though even that would remain morally horrifying. It could not explain the wider bloodshed. Charles IX's own role remains psychologically difficult. Some later accounts portray him as pressured into the decision by Catherine and the council, crying out in rage that if they were to kill, they should kill them all so none remain to reproach him. The exact words are uncertain and should not be treated as reliable transcript, but the tradition captures how later generations imagined his state, trapped between fear, manipulation, and violent outburst. What can be said is that royal authority became tied to the massacre. Whether the king initiated, accepted, or rationalized the killings, his monarchy owned them. And that ownership was fatal to trust. The crown could no longer present itself as neutral arbiter between Catholic and Protestant subjects. The king's peace had become the setting for Protestant slaughter. For Huguenots, the lesson was unavoidable. Royal promises could not be trusted when fear entered the council chamber. The monarchy had solved one immediate crisis by creating a much deeper one. Chapter 8. From Paris to the Provinces. The massacre did not remain confined to Paris. In the days and weeks that followed, violence spread to other French towns: Meaux, Orléans, Lyon, Rouen, Bordeaux, Toulouse, and others. The timing, scale, and local dynamics varied. In some places, royal orders or signals were interpreted as permission. In others, local Catholic militants acted on their own initiative. Some governors restrained violence, others allowed or encouraged it. Local politics mattered greatly. This is important because it shows the massacre as both central and decentralized. The court's actions in Paris created a model, but local communities supplied their own fuel. Religious hatred, old grievances, fear of Protestant neighbors, ambition, urban faction, clerical agitation, confusion over royal will. A massacre spreads when people believe that the center has changed the rules. The king did not need to personally order every killing in every town. Once the royal court had destroyed Huguenot leaders in Paris and justified the action as defense of the crown, local actors could interpret violence as loyalty. This is one of the most frightening mechanisms in history. Central power can send a signal it does not fully control. The signal moves through local fear. By the time it arrives, it becomes permission for things the center may not have specifically planned, but has made imaginable. The death toll remains debated. Older numbers were often inflated or politicized. Modern estimates vary widely, often suggesting several thousand dead across France, with Paris accounting for a large portion. The exact number matters historically, but uncertainty should not soften the reality. The massacre was a national trauma. It killed not only bodies but trust, political possibility, and the credibility of reconciliation. For Protestants across Europe, the event became proof of Catholic treachery. For many Catholics, especially militant ones, it was celebrated as divine deliverance. In Rome, Pope Gregory XIII ordered celebrations and a medal commemorating the killing of Coligny, though the papacy's understanding of the initial events was shaped by reports framing the massacre as the defeat of a conspiracy against the king. This reaction deepened Protestant horror. It seemed to confirm that Catholic Europe rejoiced in Protestant blood. The massacre became propaganda across the continent. Print, pamphlet, rumor, memory, and outrage carried it far beyond France. The blood in Paris became an argument in every religious conflict that followed. Chapter 9. Catherine in the dock. No figure in this case has been more heavily accused than Catherine de' Medici. She was foreign-born, Italian, female, powerful, and politically active, a perfect target for hostile myth-making in early modern Europe. Protestants portrayed her as a murderous Jezebel. Later writers turned her into an almost theatrical villain. The dark legend around Catherine grew so strong that it sometimes obscures more than it reveals. But rejecting caricature does not mean declaring her innocent. Catherine was deeply involved in court politics. She feared Huguenot power. She feared Coligny's influence over Charles. She feared war with Spain. She wanted to preserve the Valois monarchy. If she believed that Coligny and the Huguenot leaders posed an imminent threat, she may have supported or helped drive the decision to eliminate them. Her responsibility is serious. But was the entire massacre her design from the beginning? That is far harder to prove. A fully premeditated plan to invite Huguenots to Paris for a wedding and then slaughter them all has dramatic power, but the evidence points more strongly toward escalation after the failed assassination attempt on Coligny. The court likely improvised under fear, suspicion, and pressure. The massacre then expanded beyond the initial political killing. Catherine's guilt may lie not in designing every death, but in accepting the logic that murder could stabilize the realm. That is enough. She was a stateswoman of survival. But survival politics can become atrocity when every rival is seen as existential. The tragedy of Catherine is that she spent years trying to preserve the monarchy through balance and compromise, yet became associated forever with the moment when balance collapsed into blood. If she hoped to save the crown, she helped poison its legitimacy. If she hoped to prevent civil war, the massacre renewed it. If she hoped to remove one dangerous faction, she created a memory that would haunt the French monarchy for generations. The historian's task is not to turn Catherine into a demon. It is to see how a political actor under pressure can help authorize evil without needing to resemble a fairy tale monster. Chapter 10. The Guise Question. The Guise family also stands in the dock. Their feud with Coligny was personal, political, and religious. Henry, Duke of Guise, had reason to hate Coligny because of the earlier assassination of his father, Francis. Catholic militants looked to the Guise family as champions of the true faith. They had influence, armed retainers, and connections in Paris. Many suspected Guise' involvement in the attempt on Coligny's life. If the Guise family ordered or facilitated that attack, then they lit the fuse. But even if the court later expanded the violence, the initial assassination attempt created the panic that made massacre possible. The Guise family also benefited politically from the removal of Coligny and the weakening of Huguenot leadership. Yet they too did not fully control what followed. Parisian Catholic violence was larger than one noble house. The royal council's decision mattered. Urban militias mattered. The king's authority mattered. Local hatred mattered. The Guise role should not be minimized. But the massacre cannot be reduced to family revenge. The genius of the disaster, if that terrible word can be used, is that private revenge, royal fear, religious hatred, and public rumor all merged at the same moment. Each force strengthened the others. The Guise family wanted Coligny gone. Catherine feared Coligny's influence. Charles feared rebellion or lost control. Paris feared heresy and Protestant revenge. Catholic militants wanted purification. Huguenots wanted justice after the shooting. Every fear confirmed another fear. That is how political murder becomes social massacre. Chapter 11. Coligny's Gamble. Gaspard de Coligny was a victim of the massacre. But he was not merely a passive innocent in the politics that preceded it. He was a powerful leader with his own strategy. His push for French intervention in the Netherlands against Spain was bold and dangerous. He may have believed an external war could unite France and protect Protestants by turning royal energy against a common enemy. But from the perspective of Catherine and other cautious figures at court, this policy threatened to drag a divided France into war with the strongest Catholic monarchy in Europe. Coligny's growing influence over Charles IX alarmed his enemies. This does not justify his murder. It helps explain why they feared him. To militant Catholics, he represented heresy armed with royal access. To the Guise family, he represented old blood debt. To Catherine, he may have represented the loss of control over her son and the possibility of a foreign war. Coligny's tragedy is that he trusted the royal peace enough to come to Paris. Perhaps he believed reconciliation was possible. Perhaps he believed his influence with the king protected him. Perhaps he believed his enemies would not dare strike under royal eyes. That was his fatal misreading. In a court where trust had already decayed, proximity to the king did not guarantee safety. It made him more threatening. Chapter 12. The city that was ready. Paris was not merely the location of the massacre. It was a participant. The city's Catholic identity was intense. Its preachers, neighborhoods, militias, guilds, and political culture had been shaped by years of religious conflict. Huguenots were often imagined not as fellow subjects with different worship, but as enemies of God, king, and community. The arrival of Protestant nobles for the royal wedding turned fear into physical presence. The enemy was not abstract. He was in the streets, in lodgings, near the Louvre, visible. Urban massacres require social preparation. People must know whom to target. They must believe violence is permitted or necessary. They must have networks to mobilize. They must trust that punishment is unlikely. They must feel that killing is not murder, but defense. Paris had many of these ingredients before August 24th. The royal decision to eliminate Huguenot leaders then functioned like a spark inside a room full of powder. Some Parisians killed from religious conviction, some from fear, some from greed, some from obedience, some from hatred, some because crowds make individuals capable of acts they might not commit alone. This does not dissolve responsibility. It multiplies it. The massacre was not only something done to Paris by the court. It was something Paris was ready to do once the court opened the door. Chapter 13. The Survivors. Henry of Navarre survived. That survival would reshape France. At the time, Henry's situation was desperate. He was a Protestant prince in a Catholic court during a massacre of Protestant nobles. He converted under pressure and remained effectively under watch. His survival depended on flexibility, caution, and the fact that killing him would have had major dynastic consequences. Years later, Henry would escape, return to Protestantism, lead Huguenot forces, and eventually become King Henry IV of France. To secure the throne of a mostly Catholic kingdom, he converted again to Catholicism. The famous phrase, "Paris is worth a mass," is traditionally associated with him, though whether he said those exact words is uncertain. The sentiment, however, captures his political realism. Henry IV would later issue the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting limited toleration to Protestants and helping end the wars of religion. This arc is extraordinary. A man who survived the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre became the king who tried to give France a more durable peace. But that later resolution should not soften the massacre's immediate horror. Many did not survive to become symbols of reconciliation. They died nameless in streets, rivers, courtyards, prisons, and provincial towns. They left families shattered, communities frightened, and memories sharpened into sectarian hatred. Survivors carried the trauma into the next phases of war. For Huguenots, the massacre became proof that Catholic promises could never be trusted fully. For militant Catholics, the survival of Protestantism after the massacre became proof that more pressure was needed. For the monarchy, it became a stain no explanation could fully wash away. Chapter 14: The Massacre and the Wars After. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre did not end the French wars of religion. It intensified them. Another war broke out soon after. Huguenot resistance hardened, especially in fortified towns such as La Rochelle. The Crown discovered that killing leaders did not eliminate the movement. It made compromise harder and resistance more desperate. This is one of the recurring failures of political terror. It can destroy people. It can terrify communities. It can weaken networks. But it can also prove the enemy's warnings true. Before the massacre, some Huguenots might have believed coexistence under royal guarantee was possible. Afterward, many could reasonably ask, what is a royal guarantee worth if it leads us into Paris and leaves us dead? The massacre also radicalized political thought. Huguenot writers developed arguments about resistance to tyrannical rulers. If a king murdered his own subjects and violated divine justice, what limits existed on obedience? Could lesser magistrates resist? Could the people defend themselves? The massacre became part of the intellectual path toward more explicit theories of resistance. In that sense, the Crown's attempt to secure itself through violence helped weaken the ideological foundations of unquestioned monarchy. The monarchy wanted obedience. It taught suspicion. The monarchy wanted peace. It renewed war. The monarchy wanted to eliminate a threat. It created a martyrdom narrative that outlived the dead. Chapter 15: Was it planned? The question remains, was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre planned from the beginning? The strongest responsible answer is cautious. There may have been premeditation in the attempted assassination of Coligny, though responsibility remains debated. There was very likely a deliberate decision by the royal circle, after the failed assassination, to kill leading Huguenots. There was not necessarily a fully developed master plan, from the beginning of the wedding, to massacre Protestants across Paris and the provinces in the exact form events took. The violence escalated. That does not make it accidental. A disaster can be improvised and still be criminal. The court may not have planned every body in the Seine, but it chose the path that led there. This distinction matters because people often think responsibility requires total control. If Catherine or Charles did not plan every killing, then perhaps they were not responsible. That is false. Leaders are responsible not only for what they micromanage, but for the forces they unleash when they know the likely direction of violence. When rulers authorize political murder in a city full of hatred, they do not get to pretend surprise when hatred becomes massacre. Chapter 16: The Fatal Miscalculation. The fatal miscalculation was the belief that killing Huguenot leaders would prevent a larger crisis. The court feared retaliation after the attack on Coligny. It feared Protestant military action. It feared Coligny's influence. It feared Guise's Huguenot conflict in Paris. It feared losing control of the king, the city, and the kingdom. Some of those fears were real, but fear made murder look like prevention. That is the moral center of the case. The Royal Council chose violence because it imagined violence as containment. Instead, violence became contagion. The death of Coligny did not stabilize France. The killing of Huguenot nobles did not restore trust. The massacre in Paris did not end Protestant resistance. The spread to the provinces did not purify the kingdom. The royal explanation did not convince Europe. The attempt to solve politics by slaughter made every political problem worse. This is the disaster of St. Bartholomew's Day. Not only that thousands died, but that they died in an act meant, in the minds of some decision-makers, to save the state. The state survived, but its moral authority was mutilated. Chapter 17. The Trial of Responsibility. Who stands guilty? The assassins who attacked Coligny bear responsibility for triggering the crisis. If the Guise faction or its agents ordered the attack, their responsibility is grave. Catherine de' Medici bears responsibility if, as many historians believe, she supported or helped shape the decision to eliminate Huguenot leaders after the failed assassination. Even if she did not plan a general massacre, she participated in the politics that made one possible. Charles IX bears responsibility as king. He was young and pressured, but royal authority was central to the killing. The later justification came in his name. He cannot be treated as merely a frightened boy outside events. The Royal Council bears responsibility for embracing preventive murder. The Guise party bears responsibility for revenge politics and militant pressure. Parisian killers bear responsibility for turning political murder into urban slaughter. Preachers and propagandists bear responsibility for years of language that made neighbors into monsters. Huguenot leaders, including Coligny, contributed to the wider instability through armed politics and risky strategy, but they did not cause or deserve the massacre. The deepest culprit was the collapse of trust inside a religiously divided state. France had reached a point where each side could imagine the other plotting annihilation. Once that imagination becomes normal, atrocity begins to look like self-defense. That is the warning. The massacre was not born from hatred alone. It was born from hatred plus fear plus authority. Hatred identified the victims. Fear created urgency. Authority opened the door. Chapter 18. The Wound That Would Not Close. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre became a European memory almost immediately. For Protestants, it was the ultimate proof of Catholic treachery. It entered sermons, pamphlets, histories, political theory, and family memory. It confirmed the fear that no promise made by Catholic rulers could be trusted if Protestant lives depended on it. For Catholics, reactions varied. Some celebrated what they believed was the destruction of a conspiracy. Others were horrified by the excess. Political Catholics who valued order could see the danger in uncontrolled urban slaughter, even if they opposed Protestantism. Not every Catholic was a killer, and not every Catholic celebrated the massacre. But the public celebrations by some Catholic authorities deepened the divide. For the French monarchy, the massacre became one of the defining stains of the Valois dynasty. Charles IX died in 1574, reportedly tormented in health and mind, though later accounts may dramatize his guilt. Catherine continued to maneuver in a kingdom still at war. The Valois line eventually failed, and Henry of Navarre, survivor of the massacre, became king. The irony is almost unbearable. The Protestant groom who nearly died in the wedding massacre became the monarch who restored a measure of peace to France. But peace came after more war, more death, more siege, more faction, more exhaustion. The massacre did not decide the religious question. It made every later answer costlier. Chapter 19, The Verdict. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre was not an explosion from nowhere. It was the result of a kingdom where religion had become identity, identity had become politics, politics had become survival, and survival had become permission. The wedding created proximity. The shot at Coligny created panic. The court decision created authorization. Paris supplied hatred. The provinces supplied imitation. The monarchy supplied justification. And the victims supplied, unwillingly, the proof that reconciliation without trust is only a stage set waiting for fire. The massacre did not happen because 16th century people were somehow incapable of peace. They tried peace. They negotiated. They married across factions. They issued edicts. They held councils. They staged ceremonies of reconciliation. But they had not rebuilt trust beneath the ceremony. That is why the wedding failed as symbol. A marriage can unite families. It cannot unite a kingdom if each side believes the other is preparing murder. The final verdict is this: the massacre was a political crime born from fear and executed through hatred. It was not inevitable. It was chosen. Perhaps not in every detail. Perhaps not in every town. Perhaps not in every death. But chosen at the decisive center when rulers decided that killing a few would save the kingdom, and then discovered, or pretended to discover, that a city full of fear does not stop at a few. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre remains one of history's most chilling disasters because it began under the language of peace. The royal wedding promised reconciliation, but it gathered enemies into the same city before anyone had repaired the fear beneath the surface. Coligny's shooting exposed the truth. France was not healed. It was armed with suspicion. At the decisive moment, the court chose murder as crisis management, and Paris transformed that choice into massacre. The tragedy is not only that the peace failed, it is that the symbol of peace became the setting for betrayal. And that is why this case still feels so dangerous. Societies do not usually descend into mass violence because everyone wakes up suddenly insane. They descend when leaders normalize emergency, when rumor becomes evidence, when enemies are described as infection, when law bends before fear, and when ordinary people are taught that killing is defense. So what is your verdict? Was the massacre caused by Catherine's calculation, Charles's weakness, Guise's revenge, Parisian hatred, Huguenot and Catholic mistrust, or the fatal belief that violence could save the state? Leave your answer in the comments and subscribe to the History Docket as we continue reopening the disasters where history turned not on fate, but on decisions made in fear.